All right, so we're looking at the Lord's Supper, and last week we were discussing the validity of it, and that is the idea of whether or not it is something that we should even be doing. You know, when you look at worship, the Lord's worship, one of the things that you want to consider before even beginning to lay out an argument for what we might call acts of worship, right? Those particular things that we do as we come together, is whether or not God even wants us to do them first, right? You got to lay that foundation. And sometimes what we do is we just jump into a discussion on something without first considering whether or not someone actually believes that's what God even wants us to do. So what we were doing last week, we were going back and we were considering the institution of the Lord's Supper, that Jesus is the one that institutes it. He's the one that instructs us what to do, the emblems to use. It was on the night of the Passover, night of his betrayal. He took the unleavened bread, the fruit of the vine, and he instituted this memorial service. And then later on, we can actually go back and support that in the New Testament epistles. Take a look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So in trying to ascertain whether or not the Lord's Supper is something that is to be done at all, was it a one-off event? Was it just on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he set up the Lord's Supper, but it was only meant to be done at that point in time and not beyond that point in time? There's certain things you can look at in the New Testament that were done as a symbolic measure, not something that was commanded for the church and not practiced by the church after that. For example, we see foot washing taking place in the New Testament, but that was not something that was instituted as a command of the Lord, or something that the church continued to practice beyond that point, because it wasn't the foot washing that was being emphasized there. It was the symbolism of service that was being emphasized there. And foot washing was just a way to demonstrate that. And Jesus was the one that was doing it, right? He was showing himself that though he was Lord and Master, he came to serve, and he demonstrated that service. So there are some things that are like that. When you take a look in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we're noting the Lord's Supper here, Paul is dealing with a problem that's taking place in the Lord's church at this point in time. It's referred to today as the love feast. The idea that as people would come together, they would gather for a meal, they would have a meal, and they would participate in the Lord's Supper while they were doing that. And I've heard people today, talk about how what a wonderful thing that is to do that. The problem is that when you go back and look in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is actually condemning that. He's not condemning the fact that they're having a meal together. He's condemning the fact that they are not including other brethren into this, and that you've taken the Lord's Supper and you've turned it into something that it's not. And I think that's important for us to consider as well, as we can say, well, does God institute the Lord's Supper, Jesus, and does he want us to do it on a regular basis? And then does it matter how we do it? Does that play into this at all? Does it matter when you do it? Why you do it? Well, obviously, according to 1 Corinthians 11, it does, because Paul is rebuking them for what they're doing when it comes to these love feasts that they are participating in. Look what he says in chapter 11, verse 17. He says, "But in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that division exists among you, and I in part believe it." Verse 19, "For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you." So for people today to incorporate these love feasts into their Lord's Supper events as if it's something that is a positive, it's not. It is, in fact, something that Paul condemns. And again, not just the act itself, but he's talking about what they're doing in the act. If you want to have a meal, but don't incorporate these two together And then the issue of division exists there, how they're putting other people above those who have and those who do not have. So there's more problems there than just the fact that they're doing this. It's how they're doing it, why they're doing it. That also comes into play. And then Paul explains that the Lord's Supper was meant to be a separate event, a separate memorial, right? Something that is very simple in its nature and something that every Christian participates in. And then what this passage does then as well is support the fact that what Jesus instituted on the night of his betrayal, that Lord's Supper, was something that was intended for the church to continue to participate in as an act of worship. So look what he says over here in verse 23. Following this, he says, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you." Now let's stop there for a second. When Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, who's there?
Paul wasn't.
No, Paul wasn't. Who's there? Who's there? The 12 apostles are there. Even Judas is there. Remember, that's when he tells them what you go do quickly. So the apostles, and only the apostles are there. Well, I mean, there may be some people downstairs serving and whatever, but in this room where they're meeting, the apostles are participating in this Lord's Supper together. He's presenting this to them. All right. But Paul says, "I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you." Well, when did Paul receive this from the Lord? Well, it certainly would have to have taken place after Acts chapter 9, right? On his road to Damascus when the Lord appears to him. So somewhere after that point in time, it is revealed to him by the Lord himself, this thing that we refer to as the Lord's Supper or communion. That means that Paul was not just told this as a bit of information. You weren't there, but here's some information. Guess what I did on the night before I was betrayed? I instituted this thing called the Lord's Supper, but it was just a one-off. You weren't there. Just want to give you some information on it. Don't worry about it in the future. No, he's telling him this stuff because he's now instructing him, you teach the church about this. And so what do you find right here? He says, look, I received from the Lord, and obviously, let me stop here for a second. Obviously, they already know about the Lord's Supper, right? They already know about it because that's what they're coming together for. The problem is they're not coming together for the right reason, in the right way, right manner, right attitude, right? They're not doing it the way they're supposed to. So they obviously already know about it. So he's going to correct them in what they're doing, right? So he says this, "I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This is the cup. This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" That's it. I mean, he goes on after this and explains about partaking in a worthy manner. But this segment right here is him telling them, this is what you do in the Lord's Supper. This is what Jesus gave to me, the Lord gave to me, and I'm delivering this to you as he would to all the congregations of the Lord's body. The Lord took bread, he broke it. "This is my body, do this in remembrance of me." He took the cup, drank from it, gave it to them. "Drink from it, all of you. Do this in remembrance of me." He says, "For as often as you do this," what are you doing? You're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. Proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. So that in and of itself is a support in the New Testament time period after Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper in the Gospels. This, when he was still alive, this is a time and place where you actually see them, Paul saying, this is something we're supposed to be doing. And this is the manner that we're supposed to be doing it in. So without question, we have then the Lord's Supper as being something that is authorized for the church to participate in. And then again, following the Lord's Supper, we have other examples of, following Jesus's death and resurrection, we have other examples of it. It's not always worded in the same way. Paul is very specific there when he lists this out. But if you go back to Acts chapter 2, and this is before Paul is an apostle, Acts chapter 2. And really prior to Paul persecuting the church. So this is that first day of Pentecost where Peter begins to preach, and you have some 3,000 souls being baptized. And then you take a look down here in Acts chapter 2 in verse 42, right? Well, we look at verse 41 or verse 40. And with many other words, he solemnly testified and kept on exhorting them, saying, "Be saved from this perverse generation." So then those who had received his word were baptized, and they were added that day about 3,000 souls. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Now, there's debate on the meaning of the breaking of bread, because the breaking of bread actually does have several meanings to it. One meaning is simply a meal, right? But the other meaning of the breaking of bread was a term that was used to emphasize the Lord's Supper. And if you go down and continue reading here, he says in verse 46, "And day by day continue with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart." So you have the term being used twice, except for in the second time it's being used, it's making reference to them having their meals together, right? So in this one passage, verse 42, you have an example of what would be considered worship, the idea of the apostles' teaching. Does anybody remember what that word fellowship there is in reference to? So when we see the word fellowship, right, what is a typical idea of fellowship? Okay, all on the same ship, we're together, right? The word fellowship entails this idea of sharing things together, right? A sharing. In fact, it is very similar to where we get the word benevolence, right? To be benevolent. And so some have seen this as the act of contribution, that they were continuing together and they were in fellowship with one another, that they were contributing. And if you keep reading what it says here, let me take a look up here. Verse 45, "And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need." Well, that would be, in essence, a contribution. That would be a benevolent act, a sharing in what they had with others. So in verse 42, you have a sense here of a worship, them coming together and worshiping. They were breaking bread. They were contributing to the needs of the individuals. They were in acts of prayer. They were devoting themselves to what? The apostles' teaching. So that would be, in essence, the sermon being preached. So in some ways, you can see this as it were, they were coming together and participating in some form of worship early on in the first century. And if, in fact, we're interpreting this correctly and seeing the breaking of bread as being the Lord's Supper, which I don't see why they wouldn't see it that way. Jesus had instituted the Lord's Supper. They knew this. And it wasn't as if they had to wait until Paul came along in order for that to happen, right? It wasn't like, oh, now that Paul is here, now we're going to go ahead and start participating in the Lord's Supper. They're already aware of these things, right? So they're already participating in this act of worship. If you go to Acts chapter 20, this is after Paul, we see another example of it. And this is an example that's used in reference to when we partake of the Lord's Supper. But still, it's an authorized act that they're participating in. Acts chapter 20, beginning in verse 6. Paul writes, or Luke writes, "We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread," and this is referring to Paul's work, "unleavened bread, and came to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, when we gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day, but he prolonged his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together," so forth, and he talked about it. So in that example there, he specifically mentions that on the first day of the week, they were gathered together to break bread. That is a very specific statement that's being made there. It's not just like generalized. They do, in fact, have a meal, but there was an emphasis here that Paul was trying to get there for a particular reason. And he waited there, right? He's on his way back to Jerusalem, and he waits there for a particular event to come along. What is the event that he's waiting for? Well, it seems like he's waiting for the first day of the week so that he can participate in the Lord's Supper with the brethren that are there. And that's why he says, on the first day of the week, when we were, well, if you go back to verse 6, "We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, came to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, right? The first day of the week, so you're there 7 days. The first day of the week comes along. We were gathered together to break bread. So the idea that they've been there that long for a purpose, and Paul is there to take communion with them.
Jesus commanded them to do this in remembrance of me, and they were in Matthew 28:20, he said, continue to teach them all I've taught you.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a part of it.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah, going back to the Great Commission. Yeah. So we have examples of where they are coming together and they're participating in the Lord's Supper. And we know that this was something, again, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul really emphasized that this was something that was instituted by the Lord himself. He says this was given to him by the Lord. And so whatever he says then in that statement is something that is intended to be taken as authoritative. 1 Corinthians 11. So when he's telling them this, he's not giving to them as, maybe a suggestion. He's correcting what they're doing. He's not praising them in this. And he says, this is what you should be doing when you come together. You should be breaking the bread, drinking the cup, and proclaiming his death until he comes. So we know that the Lord's Supper was instituted by Jesus. We know that the early church participated in it. And we know that when someone participated in a wrong manner, they were corrected in it. And that also tells us then that if they were being corrected, if there's nothing wrong with taking the Lord's Supper in whatever way you want, using what emblems you want, doing it whenever you want, then there'd have been no need for Paul to do any correcting. He wouldn't have a leg to stand on to go and say, oh, just a second. What you guys are doing is wrong. They'll be like, well, the Lord didn't say we couldn't do it this way, right? The Lord didn't say we couldn't do it like this. He's like, well, let me tell you what the Lord said you were supposed to be doing. And by the fact that he tells them what they're supposed to be doing, then he eliminates what they are doing, right? They don't do it that way. There is a right way to do it. And the same is true for us today, right? I mean, if we look at the Lord's Supper, do we have a right to just participate in it in any way? Even to the point of the kind of attitude we have when we approach the Lord's Supper. Are we doing it mentally? Are we where we're supposed to be? Are we focusing on what we are supposed to be focusing on? Are we just nonchalant and complacent and oh, okay, here comes that cracker, here comes that. I told you this story before where there was a lady that I'd recently baptized. This was years ago. And she was leaving the worship service that morning, and she told me, she goes, man, when that communion came along, I was just like, I was barely able to take that stuff because I had just eaten a big breakfast before I got here. And then all of a sudden the bread came by, and I'm like, oh, I can hardly take another bite. I mean, she said that, and I'm like, no, I think you could have got another bite down. I don't think it would have been. We're not breaking a giant loaf of bread, and you're not drinking a quart of grape juice. It was like that. But I mean, maybe she was kind of joking with it, but I think she was serious. That she had a big breakfast that morning, and it was just. And I'm thinking, well, maybe we should teach some more on this idea of where our mind is, and how we should be thinking, or what we should be thinking of when we partake of the Lord's Supper. And remember the importance of it. Remember the sanctity of it. Now look, when you go back and you look at it, and we're going to take a look at the purpose here. When you take a look at the purpose, then you begin to understand the sanctity of it and why it's so important that they were corrected in what they were doing. Because they were not approaching it as if it were something that had authority from Christ and something that should have been addressed in a very humble manner and an honorable way, right? And I find it interesting that there are certain things that we would be appalled if someone were to act in a way that just was not befitting the event that they were in, right? And we see a lot of that today out there in churches. It's like, you're not acting in a way that's befitting what you've come there to do. So you take a look at someone who's been, let's just use a police officer. A police officer has been gunned down in the line of duty. and this person is being taken to the cemetery, and they usually have the long trains of cars and everything, and oftentimes, I do it with military, you'll see people lining the road. And can you imagine if that on that trek there, granted, if you want to be an idiot, you can, and you can say whatever you want to say. But as that's going along, you have people just acting in ways that are not befitting of what's taking place. This is somebody who gave his life in the line of duty, police, military, whatever it is, fire, and you're acting in such a way that is distracting from this moment. And then when you get to the graveside, your behavior there is inappropriate. Now, let me say this. I have done a number of funerals over the years, and there are people who are so removed from God that they want their loved one to be remembered for the biker that he was. And I'm like, I'll tell you what, I'll do your funeral, but you cannot bring in ungodly practices into it, right? I mean, if you want to come in here and talk about, how he loved his motorcycle and that was his life, fine. So to them, it's like, because that's all they have. It's a celebration of his life, because there is, to them, no life beyond this life, so we've got to remember everything that he was. Typically, when you go to a Christian's funeral, what do you want or expect to hear? The first thing I expect to hear.
Good Christian.
Do what?
Good Christian.
What?
It was with Jesus or he got.
Oh, okay, yeah. I saw you said nutrition. I'm like, no, nutrition. He wasn't very healthy when he died. That would be me. No, I want to hear of the person, how they love the Lord, that they dedicated their lives to serving God. Now, certainly you can bring in other things. You can bring in their family. You can bring in their job and how they were such a great worker. But I would suppose that as a Christian, all of those other things are a reflection of the first thing. That because this person was a servant of God, this is the kind of worker he was. This is the kind of father he was. This is the kind of husband he or wife she was, whatever it may be. So I understand that there may be certain situations where people are going to say, well, this is what we want from this because this is the person. I get that. That same thing, though, then applies to Christ. This is who he was. And this is what he asks us to remember about him when we partook of the Lord's Supper. Which means we have no right to then take it around and turn it into something that we think is better. I think the Lord would really appreciate us doing this. Well, I know that he wouldn't appreciate it. How do you know that? Because he told me what he wanted me to do. If the Lord tells us what he wants us to do in his memorial, then I think that if we're going to truly honor him for who he is, then we would do it that way. And for us to somehow think that we can spice it up a little bit, make it more impactful, then we're missing the point.
That's total arrogance. If we try to add something that he didn't ask for, that's saying that we know as good or better than he, and we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway.
Well, and it degrades that sacrifice, right? If someone gives their life in military service, police service, any of those, and they give their life in that, they gave up what most people would be considered the most precious thing you have is your life, right? They gave that up in service. How do you honor that person then? Well, you certainly don't do it in a way that is going to not reflect upon what it was that they did. So when it comes to the Lord's Supper, Paul is telling them that what they're doing in 1 Corinthians is not a reflection of what the Lord wanted them to do and what he wanted them to remember when he gave himself on that cross. So when we come to a time of participating in the Lord's Supper, then it can be a joyful, somber event, right? I think people have a misunderstanding sometimes of joy. I've heard people say this before when it comes to Christians, that you just don't seem to have any joy in your life. And I'm like, well, what are you looking for? You're looking for me to be jumping up and down, screaming, rolling in the aisle? That's a demonstration of joy? Well, joy involves an inner peace, an element that is not affected by external situations. I can be somber, but be joyful at the same time. I don't have to be screaming and jumping all over the place, saying, "Oh, look, there's a demonstration of joy." You see, if I'm at my wife's funeral and I am making a statement about her death, I'm very somber in that. But at the same time, I'm very joyful because she was a Christian. And I'm joyful that in these statements I'm making, I have within me, the kids have within them, this joy of knowing that their mother is no longer suffering, that their mother is in a place of comfort, of peace. So yes, you can be somber and then joyful at the same time. So when it comes to the Lord's Supper and we come before the Lord's Supper and we're going to participate in it, then we need to address it with the reverence that it is deserving.
Thankfulness.
Yeah.
That peace and thankfulness.
Yes.
Too many times people mix up joy and happiness. Happiness is totally dependent on circumstances. Joy is depending on your relationship with God. So the two are not necessarily mixing.
The inner peace that you have. All right, so let's take a look now and just break it down a little bit here as what the scriptures teach the purpose of the Lord's Supper is. Why do we partake of it? Well, go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 with me. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 16 and 17. Paul says, "Is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread." So, before Paul begins to correct what they're doing and then get to how they're supposed to be doing this in chapter 11, he states that their participating in the Lord's Supper is a communion of the body and blood of Christ. It's a sharing together. So as we come together as Christians and we participate in the Lord's Supper, there is a communion there in that we have something that we share in common with the person sitting next to us. What is that? The blood of Christ, his sacrifice. We share in that. And I need to partake of the Lord's Supper, and you need to partake of the Lord's Supper. No one can do it for you. You're doing it yourself. And as such, when we sit here as one body, and think about the beauty of that. As we sit here as one body, we are participating in an act which emphasizes, though we're individuals, our unity. That's what the communion does. It emphasizes, in part, it emphasizes our unity with one another. Because we are united with the Lord, which also means we're united with whom? Whomever the Lord is united with. So the Lord is united with the Father, so we're united with him and the Father. The Lord is united with other people that are united with him, right? Christians. So that means we are united with them as well. So this communion brings us into a mindset of saying we are one body. We partake of one bread, we partake of one cup, the body of Christ, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And as we participate in that, it reminds us of a unity that we have with one another. When you look at him correcting them, he's telling them that they are acting as if what? They're not united. In fact, what does he say? That there is division. There's division. There's divisiveness. You're eating, he's not. That's not showing a unity with one another. And the Lord's Supper is supposed to remind us, again, in part, of our unity that we share with one another because we share the blood of Christ. Secondly, we look at the Lord's Supper as a memorial. As a memorial. And this is what I was speaking of earlier. Give me some examples of memorials that we participate in our society.
Memorial Day.
Well, pick the easy one, Ken. Memorial Day? There's no such thing as Memorial Day. Why are you making stuff up? Oh, thank you. That was a good one, right? So we have this national, but 9/11 will be one of those Memorial Days, right? And so what's going to happen on 9/11? I imagine the president will call for the flags to be lowered at half staff, right? And even when you lower the flag at a half staff, that or half mast, that is the idea of what? It's a memorial. It's a way to remember something that's happened. This person has passed away, these people have passed away, whatever it may be, they've lost their lives. So there's going to be all these events. Can you imagine if you went to the Twin Towers or the field in Pennsylvania or the Pentagon, and you went out there and you were acting a fool of yourself during these moments of trying to remember all those lives that were lost? You think people would just be, well, yeah, I think you really get what happened here. They'd be like, don't you know what happened here? Don't you know the people that, it's like, and I, to me, this upsets me. If I go to a military memorial and I've seen foolish people who will graffiti on them, who put trash all over the place, right? I was in France, and we were at a military museum not too far from the Eiffel Tower. And Napoleon, I can't remember the name of it, whatever it is, but Napoleon, all this kind of stuff was there. And whether or not you like the leader, but here were all of these cannons and just, right? And I'm looking in the cannon, and people are shoving their trash in the thing, like it's a mobile trash can. I'm thinking that's probably why they invented this thing. They were taking it into battle with them, and the guy'd be like, I don't know where to put my trash. I'm like, here, stick it in the cannon. So, and then I went to the Louvre, right? And there's this big fountain. There's this new glass thing they built at the Louvre. But inside there's a courtyard, and there's this massive fountain, beautiful fountain, full of trash. And I'm like, how disrespectful. This is just something that man has built, right? Oh, so what? But it's got history to it. You know, somebody put a lot of work into this thing. They carved it, right? These things are ornate. And I'm like, how disrespectful to treat these things with an act that is just dishonors what it is. So you can apply that to so many different areas. Well, the Lord's Supper is a memorial. And it is the greatest memorial of all. You know, you think about the Vietnam Memorial, you think about the Korean Memorial, the Korean War, you think about all the World War. You can go overseas and you can find these massive grave sites that have been put up overseas to honor American soldiers that have been lost. Massive. They're beautiful, right? All of those things are a wonderful way to remember the lives that were laid down. But those lives were only laid down for a few men, for a time. The life that was laid down on the cross was laid down for all men for all time. So there's no greater sacrifice than that, which means there is no greater honor than to be invited into a participation. When you look at and Alan used to talk about this all the time during the Lord's Supper, he'd bring up the tomb of the unknown soldier and what it takes to be one of those men who are guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier, what you have to go through to be one of those men, right? That is a place of honor to be chosen as one of those guys that will do that. Not everybody's selected to do that. So when you are selected, and you can look at a number of different areas where you're selected to participate in a very particular thing, and there's a reason you're selected for that. The beautiful thing with us is that this is the greatest memorial of all time. That's right. Yes, the Son of God gives himself for us. And then we are honored to be invited in and to participate in that event as his disciples. There is no greater honor than for us to be invited into that moment. I say greater honor, I mean there's other honors, but you get what I'm saying, a little hyperbole. But it is a great honor to be invited in, to be able to participate in that. And as such, when you show up, we should show up in such a way as to demonstrate what it means to participate in this event every week. So those who partake of the Lord's Supper remember the cruel death of Jesus, the nails that pierced his hands and his feet, the spear that pierced his side, and the blood that was shed for our sins. And then when Jesus says that, or Paul says that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he says, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So it is a remembrance of his sacrifice, that death on the cross. And when we remember that death, it's a memorial to that because of what that death means for us. Do you remember that death? It's not just him on the cross. It's what it took to get him to the cross in the first place. God becomes flesh and dwelt among us, right? That he was tempted in all ways like us, yet he was without sin. That before he even gets to the cross, he's already being persecuted. The night that he's arrested, he's being beaten, tortured, and then eventually he makes his way to the cross. And I'm not saying that your mind has to just go over the whole list of things, but I think it's in remembering those things, it creates within us an idea of the importance of what it is that we are going to be remembering, memorializing as we partake of this Lord's Supper. And I think sometimes we understand this in regards to someone giving their life. Why is it that oftentimes when someone dies, people want to know how they died and was it quick or not, right? So if you were to think about someone who gave their life for someone else and in the process it was a quick death, I honestly believe that you can appreciate that, you can respect it. But if you hear another story of someone who did the same thing, except for what they went through to give their life was a torturous event, right? That it's in the end it was the same thing. They both died, right? But this person put themselves in such harm's way that they knew that if they were captured in doing this thing, that their torture was going to be excruciating. That has a different impact on you when you go, I mean, he was willing to run out there knowing that if he got captured that they were going to do this to him? Well, yeah, and he did it anyway. He went out there knowing that if he got captured, that what they were going to put him through would eventually lead to his death. But up to that moment, he was going to not be in a very pleasant situation at all. Now, the other guy, he also died, but he ran out, tried to save, got shot, and died. In the end, you're like, man, he saved those lives. It's a great thing. And you say, and he got shot and he died right away. Oh, what a blessing. Then you tell the story about the other guy and they're like, oh my word. I mean, he did all of that? So when you take a look at what Jesus went through, it's not just, hey, they took him, put him on the cross, he died. Like, as soon as they nailed him to the cross, he just fell over dead. It's like, no, he went through a lot before he got there. And then he went through a lot while he was there. And that really emphasizes something to us when we begin to think about that. You say, he was tortured, murdered, an innocent man for my sins. How can I honor that? How can I honor that in such a way as to demonstrate the importance of what that is? Well, see it as a memorial that should be participated in such a way as to reflect what it was that was actually done for us. Not in some haphazard way or really not considering what it was that Jesus did for us, and certainly not nonchalantly. He goes on to say that it is a proclamation. That's what Paul says over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So every man and woman, as they participate in the Lord's Supper, they do so in such a way as to proclaim something. And that's why when you look at the Lord's Supper, the individual aspect of it comes into play. I can say that Jesus gave his life for all the world. I can say that, and the scriptures are clear in that. But it's applicable personally to each individual who accepts that death. When I choose to be a Christian, a disciple of Christ, one of God's children, then I've accepted what he did for me. And thus that memorial is personal to me because he saved me from my sins. And so I, as an individual, as I sit there and I partake of the Lord's Supper, I am making an individual proclamation in that act that he died for my sins. Certainly, it's understandable that we speak of him dying for our sins. He did. But as an individual, it's an individual proclamation. So as I'm partaking this, I'm not only reminding myself, but others around me that Jesus died for me. And you're telling me that Jesus died for you. And we sit here united, remembering that Jesus died for us, individually, but congregationally as well. And then we also see it as a means of worship. You know, when you take a look at the idea of proskuneo, what worship is, it's the idea of showing affection towards, right? A kissing towards, showing affection toward someone, something. And in this case, when we're looking at worship, when we see it as the Lord's Supper, we see it as an act of worship because it is that which demonstrates our gratitude, our love, and our reverence for God. We're acknowledging what he did for us as we partake of the Lord's Supper. So in that acknowledgement, in that proclamation, and in doing it in such a way that aligns with what it's all about, the seriousness of it, then we are showing to our God our gratitude, our love, our respect, honoring him, what he did for us. So then it falls under the category then of being an act of worship. We give honor in remembering what God did for us in sending his son, what the word did as he went to the cross and sacrificed himself for our sins. So we enter into, in that particular instance, it is an act of worship that we are participating in. God instituted it. Christ instituted it. It is something that is intended for the church to participate in. There's a right way to do it, and there's a right attitude to have in it. And certainly when you're looking at those characteristics of it, you have to see it then, and what you're doing in it is an act of worship to God, honoring him. Ultimately, the Lord's Supper is an act of worship wherein Christians share a remembering and a proclaiming of the Lord's death. And so as we come together and we participate in the Lord's Supper, that's what we're trying to do. That's what we want to do. Because Jesus instituted it, because of its reference, what it stands for, what it means, the idea that his death, remember it was instituted on the night of the Passover, and the Passover was a freedom from death, a freedom from slavery, eventually, right? Death passed over those firstborn, and because of that, Pharaoh released them from slavery in Egypt. They came out of bondage. Jesus' death allows the wages of sin, which is death, Romans 6:23, to pass over us. He took that upon himself, and because we've accepted his sacrifice, we are freed from the slavery to sin, released from captivity, and now are free in Christ. So we need to get, and if you go back and you look at the Sabbath day for the Jews, it was a remembrance of them being brought out of bondage in Egypt. That was the focus of it. Remember what I did when I brought you out of slavery. The Passover was a reminder of death passing over those individuals, and it passed over them because they did it the way God said. If any Hebrew would have chosen not to put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel, there had been no expectation for them to have been saved. The same can be true for us. If we're unwilling to receive the blood of Christ in the way that God has intended, then should be no expectation that we'll be saved, even if we're partaking of the Lord's Supper. Because you can partake of the Lord's Supper and not be a Christian. All you're doing is having unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. But that's not a memorial. Because if we're to truly be a memorial to you for what God intended, it is designated and designed for his followers. That's who is given the responsibility and the right to participate. So next week, we'll get into that, the idea of who and when we should partake of the Lord's Supper, and that'll be the conclusion.